I have Donna Berry with me too, our lead underwriter. What we're going to do is run through a few slides. It's relatively brief today. It's a very, very important topic. And you hold your questions till the end and we'll answer all your questions. So why don't we go ahead and jump into this thing. So I personally have been doing builder's risk for a long, long time. And this seems to be one of the most things that agents don't understand or they don't understand the importance of it. To me, if we don't get this topic right, if we don't insure a project for the right amount, everything else doesn't quite matter. I don't know any of you have ever delivered a check that's either too much or not enough. So what we're really trying to get to is the right amount. What is the right amount to insure a construction project? So that's really the purpose of this webinar today. So once again, this is critical. I always think, you got to start off something correctly. If you don't, then whatever comes after that's probably just multiplying something that was wrong. So we're going to go into a pretty deep dive into the coverage form, talking about what completed value is, how do we estimate what it is. Hopefully these are things that will help your conversations with your contractors, because contractors are an interesting group. They're going to say, well, I want to pay the least amount, but I think they also want the best coverage. So that's what we're trying to get to. And then we'll finish up after we do this with answering any questions that anybody has. And for the purpose of these webinars, we're trying to make this very educational. This is not marketing driven towards our form only. These are things that would apply regardless of which carrier you're using for builder's risk. Now, I hope it's us, but like I said, this is something that you can carry with you through all builder's risk projects. All right, so let's talk about a completed value builder's risk form. This is probably, I'm going to guess, 90 to 95% of all builder's risk policies, or for our West Coast friends that say course of construction policies, are written on a completed value basis. So what does that mean? That means in order to avoid co-insurance, you need to insure for the completed value of the structure. That's really what builder's risk is based on. The rates are contemplated, the rates are promulgated based on going from 0 amount at risk to 100% at risk when the project ends. So it's critical that we get that completed value correct in the beginning. So let's talk about what that is. Another way of looking at this is, I'm going to throw this out there, you could jot it down, but it's selling price minus land. If you don't remember anything from today's conversation, if you remember selling price minus land, you've accomplished something. And we sit down with the builder and they're going to say, what should I write this thing for? Say, how about selling price minus land? So total estimated completed value means all costs associated with the building and designing of the covered property. So the easiest way to look at this is labor and materials, all labor, all materials, all overhead business expenses. And we'll take a stab at that because I get asked this question a lot. It's basically any expense associated with the job that is not labor and materials. That's kind of a political answer, but it's true. So labor, materials, overhead, and the fourth one up there is profit. Profit is optional. Profit will not affect the co-insurance calculations, but if you report the profit when you initially write the policy and include that in the limit that you write the policy for, then you have profit coverage. That's probably for another topic for another day, but I would always recommend including the profit simply because builder's risk rates are pretty low. It's kind of a pseudo time element coverage, and it allows you to insure a builder's profit for a very low premium charge. So labor, material, overhead, and profit. Co-insurance. We've all been in insurance a number of years, I know, and you learned that simple thing stating did over should have times the loss, right? So let's talk about that for a second and what it means for builder's risk. So first of all, these are completed value builder's risk forms. So the way they're going to calculate what you should have carried on the project is what is the total completed value of the project, labor, material, overheads, and profit, okay? So let's take a look at this co-insurance. Get this out of here. Nope, that's not right. There we go. So let's say, heaven forbid, that you write this for less than the total completed value. So what you're going to do is take the reported value, which is just another way of saying, what did you write the policy for? What is the policy limit? What's on the deck page? Divided by the total estimated completed value. Then you would take that times the total amount of loss or damage before the deductible times that percentage. Then you would take the deductible out, and that's what you would get paid. So the way I look at this is, first of all, you're trying to get to the right amount to insure a project. So the right amount is the total completed value, total estimated completed value. We don't want to overinsure it. We don't want to underinsure it. We want to get to the right amount. And that's why I've talked to hundreds of builders over the years. And if you keep it really simple and say, what's the selling price minus land? They pretty much know what it is. They know what that figure is, and that's what we want to write the policy for. So it shouldn't be a problem. But I just point this out because if it is underinsured, you could run into some co-insurance issues. I will say some forms have some forgiveness on co-insurance on partial losses, and that's fine too, but I still wouldn't want to rely on that. I always go back to the fact if we write this for the correct amount in the beginning, then we don't have to worry about it going in the event of any kind of claim, be it a total claim or a partial loss. So let's take a look at what we're talking about. What constitutes completed value? First of all, the hard costs. Brick and mortar cost is actually the materials associated with the physical structure. Concrete, steel, lumber, frame, the electrical, the plumbing, all of that is the hard costs. It does include the landscaping. We get asked that question a lot. It probably includes the rough plumbing that is on the job site. Another thing that people forget about is even the land clearing. If you're going to clear a lot, you have to pay someone labor to clear it. They might be sitting on a backhoe clearing the lot, but the labor for that is included in the completed value. So even though there's no material cost, there's a labor cost to that. And usually when you talk to a builder, they can understand what hard costs are. So you explain that, they say, okay, that makes sense. Soft costs. This is probably one of the most misunderstood topics in builder's risk. So soft cost, as we call them, what we see here, legal fees, insurance premiums, architect fees, engineering fees, are all things that are built into the cost of a project. But you got to remind them all those things are built into the cost. And all of these things are covered on the builder's risk form under completed value. Where it gets confusing is a lot of companies will build in a soft cost or have an optional coverage, and that coverage is after the claim. After there's been a covered cause of loss, now you got to rebuild the structure and you have reoccurring costs. So you can increase the soft cost coverage for a nominal fee, usually with carrier, but that is after the claim. What we're talking about now on these soft costs are what goes into the project. Remember, selling price minus land, and we're off and running. So the selling price does include all of the soft costs. Next question we get almost on a daily basis are this. And this is kind of the basics of property insurance. That's what we talked about, value. We talked about co-insurance. Now let's talk about the valuation that we get asked about every day. First one is replacement cost. Everybody always says, oh, that's the best. I want replacement cost. All right, this probably is the broadest coverage because basically replacement cost is this. It's the amount to replace an asset at the present time with no depreciation considered. So replacement cost is great. Then we have actual cash value, which is pretty simple. Replacement cost minus depreciation gives you the actual cash value. And the third thing I put up here, which is an option with some companies, called stated value. It's an endorsement that replaces the valuation provision in the form. Stated value is just that. We're going to touch on that in a little bit, but keep in mind that in builder's risk, we basically have two different kinds. We have ground up new construction and we have renovation and remodeling projects. So these things all kind of interact differently depending on if it's new or remodeling. Just take a stab at that. So we have a ground up new construction. We're building $1 million house. So you're saying, okay, how do most forms respond? Well, even if it's an ACV form and you've written the policy for the completed value of the structure, there will be no depreciation. So ACV and replacement costs are going to be the same thing for ground up new construction, as long as you wrote the policy initially for the total estimated completed value. Where it gets a little more tricky is when you have a renovation remodeling policy, because you have an existing structure. So how do we treat that existing structure? It's a 100-year-old building. It's $1 million building, and they're going to put $1 million into it, renovations. So the renovation piece of that project would be just like completed value. So as long as you had $1 million, there's no depreciation, everything's fine. Where it gets a little tricky is the existing structure, that $1 million existing structure. It's a 100-year-old building. It's an ACV form. So there's a lot of depreciation that's going to be factored in. So first thing you say is, well, I want replacement cost on that. Well, most carriers will not write replacement cost on a 100-year-old building. Doesn't make underwriting sense. So then the next thing is, how do we get around this? The best way to do remodeling and renovation existing structures is on a stated value endorsement. And what that says is, you as an agent are going to talk to the underwriter and negotiate a stated value. You're going to say, this building's worth $1 million. And you're going to prove to the underwriter why you want to write it for $1 million. So you attach the stated value endorsement for $1 million. In the event of a claim, a total claim, you're going to get paid $1 million because that's the stated value. So it really doesn't factor into depreciation anymore because it's not ACV anymore. It's stated value. So as long as you have that agreement with the underwriter, it is the best way to write remodeling and renovation. Now, I will say, sometimes the coinsurance is still there, so you definitely do not want to underinsure or overinsure a project. You're trying to get to the right amount. So what is that building really worth? So hopefully that helps you out. Ground up new construction, I wouldn't worry too much about it. On the remodeling renovations, I would always ask for stated value. Man, that is it, kind of it in a nutshell. In 15 minutes, we covered the topic. It's interesting that, like I said, I've been doing this a long time, and every day I get these questions. And I always feel like I have to go back to the very basics of property insurance in the marine insurance. It's like, what do I insure this for? How am I covered? What happens in the event of a total loss? What happens in a partial loss? In the marine, builder's risk is different than property, but obviously that's what it was born out of. So we have to understand these things. And the other thing that I really, sometimes the banks are going to require a certain type of coverage or a limit. You got to kind of explain it to them. I mean, years ago, banks used to make insurance companies include the land. Now the banks understand the land is not covered on the form, so we don't have to include the land anymore. So I do think it's up to us as an industry to explain to the banks what these coverages, what it actually is covered. So I think the stated value is an important one that you need to understand, and I would dive deep into it. Once again, Donna and I are here to talk about these things at any time, so pick up the phone and call us. I think now is the time to ask some questions. So let's wait and see if we get some questions asked.
Okay, Jeff, we had a couple questions come in. One I'll just address really quickly. It asked about if the slides will be available. And yes, the presentation is being recorded, so the webinar recording and the presentation will be available later this week on our website. You will receive an email with a link to both, so just watch out for that. First question that came in, what about a building that is a phased project?
All right, so it's a good question. So what about a building that's phased? So we get asked this, completed value is just that. What is the completed value of the entire project? So if they're building one building or 100 buildings, what is the total project completed value? And you're going to write a policy for that completed value, the whole amount. So that's remember when I said builder's risk is predicated on going from 0 amount at risk to 100%. So, if it's phased over many years, you could probably work a deal with a carrier to write one policy per phase. I've seen that done before. So let's just say it's a home builder and there's a subdivision. There's going to be 3 phases over a number of years. You might be able to write a policy for each phase. That's one way of doing it. Or you could, I didn't really get into reporting forms today, and you could do that, where you report the completed value of each structure over time. It's another way to do it. Actually, a third way is a blanket policy. So that's, like I said, we could get really deep into this, but I think the key to remember on a project is, what is the project? $1 million building is 10 $1 million buildings. Let's write a policy for the completed value, and then we'll be set. Hopefully that answers it.
They did add a little bit more information. It said example of 4-story historic building, 1 floor at a time.
Yeah, so but it's still one project. It's one building. They're going to renovate the entire building over a course of 2 years or a year or 3 years, whatever they're going to do. So you'd write a policy for that entire time for that building. Like I said, a little more different if you have like a home builder building, 500 homes over the course of the next 5 years. You might want to put him on a reporting form. It's a little different, but the historic building would be one policy, going from 0 at risk to when you're finished with the project.
Okay.
And I will say, historic buildings are the tricky ones to try to get the right amount, the stated value. But we have ways of doing that. You just got to talk to your underwriter. It's kind of a negotiation a little bit to figure out exactly what the per square foot cost should be. Once again, we don't want to underinsure it. We don't want to overinsure it. Okay.
Ready?
I'm done.
Okay. Let's see. Can flood insurance endorsement be added to your builder's risk policy? If so, do you require at least 1.5 feet between base flood elevation and the lowest floor elevation?
Okay, we don't have any particular requirements on elevation as far as that. That would always be individual zoning based on where the structure is being built. What was the first part of the question, Jillian? I didn't quite hear it.
Can flood insurance endorsement be added to the policy?
Oh yeah, what we do is we do have flood available, we have earthquake available, but we're going to map each individual project. So depending on what flood zone it's in, that will dictate our rate and dictate our underwriting appetite for that area. So I guess that makes sense. So it really depends on the zone, which we have the ability to look that up based on an address. Hope that helps.
Okay, let's see. There's an ongoing debate or a misunderstanding about soft costs and business interruption.
That is a very, very good question, and there's such a debate going on that we're probably going to have to do a separate webinar on that, because that's how involved it gets. But just trying to keep it as simple as possible. First of all, both of the coverages, the first trigger is there has to be a covered cause of loss. So there was a fire. Now, what does the soft cost endorsement cover? And the other term that we use now instead of business interruption is delay in completion. That's more of an AAIS form. But yeah, without going into great detail, I would say we need to probably have another webinar on that, because we could take 15, 20 minutes and talk just about that. So hopefully that's kind of punting a little bit, but I've been thinking about that because we get that question a lot. They are different. They're not the same. Do not assume they're the same.
Okay, he did go on to say soft costs are contractors' exposure to be covered in a builder's risk policy. I don't know if you understand that.
I like that. So this is definitely reinforcing my idea that we need to have a webinar on this. But so let's talk about soft costs real quick. So soft costs is just examples that we gave you: the engineering fees, architect fees, insurance premiums, advertising fees. Let's say a home is completed. It's $1 million home and it's completed. A fire comes along and burns it down. Now we got to rebuild that house, right? So, and they reported completed value. They had labor, material overhead, and soft costs, had everything built in. So we write them a check for that. But now you have a reoccurring fee that's going to happen again over and above that. So some of those soft costs will reoccur. Maybe the insurance premiums reoccur, so you have to insure it the second time. So what you can do is include those additional reoccurring costs under a soft cost endorsement. Some forms build in a little bit automatically. It's nothing you want to look at. But so you want to make sure that if that is a concern on those reoccurring expenses, that you add additional soft cost coverage to the form. my endorsement. I don't know, hopefully that helps, but delay and completion, a little different, a little more involved as far as that goes. But once again, if we can get everybody to ensure labor, material, overhead, and profit, we'd be ahead of the game. We'd have very few problems out there when it comes to claim time. Questions?
Okay. No other questions at this time.
All right, so once again, I really appreciate your time today, about 25 minutes. We try to keep these things to about this length. Hopefully it's beneficial and educational for you. Our contact information is up on the screen. Feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call, email us at any time. We are builders risk specialists. That's what we do every day, all day long. So I always like to make a little joke. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I know a lot about builders risk. So we do it all day. We're here to help you in any way. Hopefully we didn't confuse you too much, but it is a pretty complex subject, and so it takes time to talk about it. So this is kind of our ongoing series of educational webinars, which we'll be doing more as the year goes on. So once again, thank you and appreciate it, and have a great afternoon.